Imagine reading curated opinion pieces that aim to help us better understand policy and politics from the people closest to it, or sometimes people who want to be far from it. We offer political insights without the limit of column inches. Introducing Quotes by Air Quotes Media, creators of the Herle Burly and Curse of Politics podcasts, where we bring politics from the inside out. And now with Quotes, you can read from contributors like Jim Coyle, Jim Stanford, and Kathleen Wynne, with more to come. Read Quotes at airquotesmedia.com/quotes.
Greetings, you curiouser and curiouser Herle Burlyites. It's one of those high-pressure pods here on the Herle Burly, the kind where I don't waste any time with off-the-top random musings about my favorite thing, rum, or my other favorite thing, more rum. We have the Honourable Sean Fraser with us today, a fan of rum himself, Minister of Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship. A proud son of Pictou County, Minister Fraser first entered public life in 2015 when he was elected MP for Central Nova. Before politics, he had a successful legal career practicing commercial litigation and international dispute resolution, and prior to his current cabinet post, he served as Parliamentary Secretary in a number of portfolios, to the Minister of Finance and the Minister of Middle Class Prosperity, good work on that one, to the Minister of Environment and Climate Change, as well as to the Deputy Prime Minister. And here's an interesting tidbit we're surely going to put to the test today. Minister Fraser was chosen as Best Orator during Macleans' 12th Annual Parliamentarians of the Year Award. So here's where we're going with this. We'll find out a little bit more about Minister Fraser's life and what shaped him for a career in politics, and then the meaty stuff about his key immigration, refugees, and citizenship portfolio. Where's he and the government going with it, and why? What are some of the knockdown issues he's dealing with around housing, wage impacts, and temporary workers? And finally, we'll talk some pure politics about the Liberal Party, about Parliament today, the next election, and anywhere else his oration skills take us. Minister Fraser, such a pleasure to have you on today. Thanks for making the time to chat.
It's a pleasure to be with you. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, great. Where do we find you today? You're in a Delta hotel.
Yeah, that's right. Look, I'm a few blocks from Parliament Hill, and because my first few meetings were virtual, I get to do it from the hotel room here. So you saved me a walk in the morning to the Hill, and we'll be there before too long, though.
Oh, okay. Do you live there when you're in Ottawa?
Look, every week, based on what hotel seems to have availability for me. I used to have an apartment here years ago, but when the family's not coming up as often, I've been doing the hotel thing for a while.
Okay. Best to leave the family in the riding. That way you go back.
Look, it wouldn't be an option. I don't think the voters would keep me elected if I wasn't living in the community I represented.
Well, that's ultimately what happens. It's been my experience in observing it. So listen, I want to start by saying that today, the day we're talking, is the third anniversary of the massacre at Pictou in Nova Scotia. And I guess we should first observe that because everybody in Nova Scotia is observing that. And the second thing I'd like to ask you is, after the results of the inquiry, do you have an understanding that you're comfortable with about how the RCMP failed people of Nova Scotia so badly that day, those 2 days?
Look, David, you kind of hit me right in the feels to start things off. I sent a couple messages out to some of the family members today who've been impacted. There's a personal friend of mine whose sister was killed that day. There's not a family in Nova Scotia who's not been impacted by what took place in Pictou and around Nova Scotia 3 years ago. I've read through the recommendations of the Mass Casualty Commission. If I'm being honest, I think it's going to take me a few months to fully appreciate just how dramatic some of the failures were of the RCMP. But more importantly, what the solutions are to make sure that we're not putting our communities at risk going forward. I think to myself, how did my mother-in-law, who's a dual citizen, receive an emergency alert from the embassy in the United States more quickly than we received one from our local detachments? I've talked to some of the families and communities that have been impacted who say, how are we going to be dealing with people who didn't grow up in this community and expect that they should know where the back roads are that this guy was using when everybody who's from our community knows them like the back of our hand? There's going to be a lot to unpack to fully understand. I think the Commission has, despite some real challenges with the process playing out and some obviously very emotional subjects that needed to be discussed. They've come up with some pretty hefty recommendations that I think we're going to have to take a long look at. I'm going to be speaking with Minister Mendicino later today to discuss some of our mutual reactions to the report now that we both had a bit of time with it to discuss what next steps may look like. But as a Nova Scotian, we can't afford to look the other way on this one. This is some pretty serious stuff, and we got to do everything we can to protect the families that we represent.
Yeah. It seems pretty unlikely that the RCMP has the confidence of Nova Scotians right now. So you either have to change the police force or change them in a way that makes people feel like they can have confidence in them again.
Yeah, and I distinguish between, like in many of professions, between police officers and the RCMP as an institution. The reality is people who get to meet police officers, whether they're Mounties, municipal cops, or part of a provincial force, these are guys and girls who are putting their lives on the line to protect the rest of us. And there's an enormous appreciation for people in rural Nova Scotia for the service of frontline first responders. But after what we've been through, after having seen the report that's dug into this, down to the critiques of the quality of notes that were taken, down to the inability for different officers to be communing with one another, let alone communing with the public. There's a lot of trust that's been broken down, and the conversations that I'm having with the communities in terms of the critiques at an institutional level is whether the RCMP is in fact well positioned to be providing community policing services. Of course, there's not a viable alternative today to simply replace the community policing that the RCMP does do throughout much of rural Canada with some alternative. But these are the kinds of questions that ordinary people who have no background in public safety are starting to ask, because if they live in a town that has a local police force, they see the cops who grew up there who are playing basketball with their kids in the neighborhood, and they know that that officer is going to actually spend their life living and working in that community. And that's how you build trust. You don't do it with some rule change over 6 months. You do it with a lifetime of service to community that people know and that people are a part of. These are the kinds of things that we're going to have to dig in deep on because the public obviously is demanding change for very good reason. But identifying the right kind of change that will restore that confidence and enhance public safety is what the next steps are going to involve.
Yeah, listen, thank you for that. It was very thoughtful. I want to get lighter right now and say, listen, you represent a riding that used to never go Liberal. It's a McKay stronghold over decades. I worked in a by-election there. It's as Tory blue as it gets. At least it was as Tory blue as it gets. What's happened that you rack up large majorities there now, election after election? Has the area changed? Have the parties changed? What's changed?
Look, change is constant in parties and communities, but there's one of the things that I've come to understand very well is people care a lot less about what partisan stripe you wear and a lot more about whether they think you can help. I remember in 2015, my first campaign in federal politics, dealing with folks who were surprisingly open about their very real anxieties. If you just showed up on their doorstep and asked them what was on their mind, when you were dealing with people who were struggling with the cost of housing, and you could communicate to them that you knew when they were going to get a raise on their seniors pension that 30% of it is immediately going to be eaten up by the government, so to speak. Forget which level of government you're talking about. The fact that you even understood something that basic caused people to break down and feel like, hey, there might be hope that there's somebody I can talk to here who's actually going to understand what I'm going through, and maybe, just maybe, is going to make a difference to allow me to have a better opportunity to afford a place to live. Same thing when you're dealing with the ordinary cost of living, the ability to find meaningful work in a person's community. My sense is the days of my grandparents, where my grandfather, by the way, got highway work when the provincial Liberals were in power and worked in the digging graves and worked in the woods when the Tories were. Those days are gone. You used to be able to drive down the 245, the highway I grew up on. And you could say this is a Liberal house. The next three are Conservative. There's another Liberal. Occasionally, you'd bump into an NDP house in rural Nova Scotia, and you knew for generations the way that they supported political parties. That's rare now. You still got the groups at Tim Hortons where you got the guys who defend their party, the guys who defend the other, those are a minority of people now. I think people are far more interested in whether you're speaking to their anxieties and whether you're providing solutions that they see themselves in, rather than just playing for the right team.
Cool. All right. So you were practicing law and you decided to run in the 2015 election. First of all, lawyers make good money if they're good. So there's a financial consideration to doing that. But I'm just generally interested in why you were motivated to run and take that leap. And I hasten to add that you were running for politics, not for government. I mean, you chose to run for a third party in a riding that we never hold. So it wasn't like you were parachuted into cabinet or something like this. I mean, you just decided, my riding's open that I grew up in, and I'd like to take a crack at it. Why did you do that?
Yeah, it was a unique set of circumstances that created the opportunity. There was actually a Liberal candidate in my riding before me who stepped down over a policy objection, ironically, which I shared at the time, but not seriously enough to not consider an opportunity to make a contribution. So I was living in Calgary at the time. I spent about 5 years in the city. Absolutely love the city too. I go back whenever I get an opportunity to. But one of the things that I internalized when I was having this conversation with myself was the fact that I didn't really move out west by choice. I had to. My wife and I both were lawyers by trade, but at that point in our careers had racked up hundreds of thousands of dollars of student debt through our undergrad, through law school, and both of us did master's programs overseas. And continuing to work in Nova Scotia was not an economic option. The reality was a lot of my pals that I grew up with who worked in the trades, some of them found a job at home, and we're lucky that we have a handful of institutional employers in our community. But even the people who weren't dealing with massive student debt they needed to pay off, having a job was not a certainty, and having a good job was something to be proud of, but it wasn't an opportunity for most people. Most people my age have done a stint out west, whether it's in the oil patch, working in Toronto or Calgary, or maybe even overseas somewhere. And I was part of that trend. In fact, the thing that really convinced me to take the leap, I started thinking about what my family was doing. I've got 5 sisters. The oldest is a doctor who moved to Ontario. The next oldest was a chiropractor who started a small business in Ontario. I was a lawyer who moved out to Calgary. My younger sisters were teachers, neither of whom was working in Nova Scotia. And my youngest sister, who just finished her undergrad at St. FX University, moved to Halifax to become an accountant. And of the 6 of us, had you asked us 10 years prior, what did we want to do? None of us would have had an answer, but we all would have wanted to be around home. Not one of us was living and working in the place that we cared about most, where our parents were, where we wanted to raise our kids. And the thing that really hit me was this was not unique to my family. This was everybody my age that lost an opportunity to contribute to the community that they loved more than anything in the world. And look, come visit us in the summer. It's a great place to call home. But I thought to myself, if I had an opportunity to create an environment where people could find meaningful work, earn good money, and make a life of it at home, that's something meaningful to dedicate your career to. I loved practicing law. I loved the job I had. I was one of those rare folks who really, really enjoyed life after law school and practicing in a big law firm environment. But I decided the opportunity to have an impact on the community that I grew up in, and creating a realistic scenario where people could find good jobs at home was 100 times out of 100 a better career option for me.
You know, it's rare for you to be a happy lawyer. There's so many unhappy lawyers. When I used to recruit candidates, lawyers was a very good place to start because there's so many of them desperate for a career change. So, just a few weeks ago, the Auditor General released a report on the status of rural connectivity here in Canada. Spoiler alert for all you curious Hurly-Burlyites inclined to search it up for yourselves, we could be doing better. We've talked a lot about rural connectivity here on behalf of our presenting sponsor, TELUS. Of all the providers, they are the leading advocates for our smaller places having access to the digital tools they need to thrive. Not just words. TELUS has the strongest track record of bringing that connectivity to Canada's rural and Indigenous communities. It's a great big country. Somebody's got to connect it. One key finding of the auditor's report, of the $1.5 billion in federal funding from the ISED's Universal Broadband Fund and the CRTC's Broadband Fund to get our rural and remote communities connected, only about 25% has been spent so far. And we need it to flow faster to meet the government's targets of connecting 100% of Canada by 2030. TELUS is already the platinum partner on this file. They've been collaborating with federal and provincial governments, local communities, and Indigenous partners for years now, working with each community to invest in the infrastructure and technology that best suits their needs, bringing it all in on time and on budget. TELUS are keen to up the ante. They're ready to work with all levels of government to identify every opportunity and accelerate the rollout of the funding to help Canada not only meet the 2030 target, but try and beat it. As I said earlier, we're a big country. Somebody's got to connect it. TELUS has proven they're doing exactly that. Go to telus.com/rural to learn more. People are going to get impatient if I don't ask you something important soon, and because you've ended up in a very important portfolio that is getting a bit more controversial. You've raised the immigration targets significantly, and I don't know that any country in the world is admitting as many immigrants per capita as Canada is now. I'd like you to take a little bit of time and just explain to me, what is your policy and why are you pursuing it?
I think sometimes we have the bad habit in government of making big problems seem complicated just because they're big. The challenge that we're dealing with Canada's population involves a lot of effort to overcome, but the nature of the problem is fairly simple. Canada needs more people for a number of reasons. My view is that we need them primarily for economic and demographic reasons, and I'll share with you just why that's the case. There's two aspects to we often talk about the labor shortage, which we needed to address coming out of the pandemic, but we should be equally concerned about the skills shortage that will exist for the next few decades. If we look at the labor shortage, though, the need to respond acutely to the post-pandemic challenge and frankly, opportunity, we were dealing with a situation where the entire world was competing for the same pool of talent, a pool of talent, by the way, that had become more willing to look for economic opportunities in other countries than at any other point in history before, at a time when mobility of people who have skills is actually been also at as high a level as it's ever been. So in order to take advantage of the economic opportunity, we needed to create pathways for more people to come to Canada to make a contribution to our economy. As part of it, and it doesn't take a rocket scientist to have figured out that we needed more people to respond acutely to the labor shortage. We had the economic context. A lot of people aren't really aware how strong Canada's economic recovery has been compared to a lot of our comparators on the international stage. We've got the lowest unemployment rate, more or less, than we've ever had in this country. We've got more people engaged in the workforce than ever. Today, there's about 850,000 more people working in the economy than before the pandemic, not at the depths of the pandemic, than before the pandemic. Having record employment levels at the same time you've got GDP growth beyond pre-pandemic levels, and you've got record low unemployment, you're dealing with a situation where whatever training opportunities we put in place, whatever measures we embrace to bring more parents into the workforce, whatever measures we advance to make the workplace more inclusive, to bring marginalized groups and Canadians living with disabilities in the workforce, we can't satisfy the demands of the labor market with a domestic population. In order to maximize the economic opportunity and allow a lot of those businesses who've been beat up during the pandemic to hang on, We needed to bring the workers back into the economy so we could have the supply side of the equation taken care of now that the demand has finally returned after the pandemic. The long-term trend that concerns me more is really the demographic trend. We've got an aging population in this country, and we're feeling it in Atlantic Canada in advance of everyone else. If you go back half a century, there were 7 workers for every retired person in this country. Today, the number's closer to 3, and in my region, in Atlantic Canada, it's closer to 2. This is not a sustainable population dynamic to maintain. If we bring more young people with skills that will be applied over the next number of decades, we can help combat this demographic trend. At the same time, we have the workers to build homes, the workers to take care of our parents as they age, and the workers who are going to embrace economic opportunities for Canadian business in the green economy, in the tech sector, in AI and cybersecurity. There are major opportunities if we open the door to the people who have the skills we need. And my view is that bringing people in large numbers is a big part of that equation.
Okay, it's so interesting for me to hear you talk about that way, because I'm really interested in the motivations of what we're doing. When I was younger, I thought that immigration to Canada, our immigration policy, was a values-based thing, and it was an expression of our generosity and openness to the world. And it was a magnanimous gesture on our part to welcome people to come in and share in the prosperity that we had here in Canada. Now you are, and frankly, most people describe it as an economic imperative for the country. So it's not a magnanimous gesture on our part. It's something we need, and it's an economically driven thing. So is it an expression of our values, or is it an economic imperative?
Look, indulge me for 20 seconds, and I'll tell you about the first conversation that I had with a senior partner at the firm I started with in Calgary. He was the most hardcore conservative libertarian person I've met in my entire life. But he did teach me something that stuck with me despite our wide gap in our political values. He said, one of the things you're going to come to understand, Sean, in working in the law is you can trust a person's self-interest more than you can trust their goodwill. But when those two things align, my goodness, you get a recipe for a deal. It might just be the case that we can speak to Canadian values, remaining open, embracing multiculturalism, and recognizing that diversity is an enormous strength, both social and economic strength, and see at the same time that we're not just helping the people who come here, but it's serving our interest by having them fill key gaps in the economy. Now, there is always going to be a significant space for Canada to have purely humanitarian immigration and refugee resettlement opportunities, as evidenced by our outsized role on Afghanistan, Ukraine, and refugee resettlement more broadly. But let's not ignore the fact that almost 100% of the labor force growth in this country is driven by immigration. If we didn't have newcomers arriving to fill key gaps in the economy, we'd be in a world of hurt. This is something we've come to rely upon, but this is Canada's history. Everybody in this country who's not Indigenous either came here from somewhere else or had their ancestors come from somewhere else. Mine came from Scotland 250 years ago on a boat, and I now play the bagpipes and live 10 minutes from where their boat washed ashore. This is the story of Canada. We are a collection of diaspora communities and Indigenous communities that have learned how to make it work together.
Yeah, my mom didn't speak English till she went to school. So that's we're all in that boat one way or another. Although my mother came from Ukraine, and now I notice that almost all of our immigrants are coming from a relatively small number of countries: India, China, the Philippines, in particular. Why those locations?
It's fascinating because Canada doesn't select countries that we will accept immigrants from. Now there are rules around visas for visitors that may differ between countries for certain, but you tend to see that people-to-people connections build as more people come from a particular country. When you see a diaspora community grow in a rapid way, as the population in particular of India continues to grow and is about to, if it hasn't already, surpassed China as the most populated country in the world, you're going to see large numbers of people come, and you always see a second wave of family members, of social circles, of business partners who want to follow in the years that follow the latest tranche of newcomers to Canada. We've not made a decision that we're going to accept disproportionately large numbers of people from any particular country, but the social phenomenon builds, and over time you actually see industries in those other countries prop up to say, we're going to help facilitate your participation in the process to make it easier to immigrate to Canada should you want to. Those things, which can create challenges of its own, but you do see that there's some momentum builds behind certain different countries. It's gotten to a point where, in fact, it's created opportunities with certain provincial governments that are now actually having their health authorities work with educational institutions in particular provinces or regions of these other countries to smooth the certification process for them to get here, because they have a reliable number of people who are going to be interested in coming and want to work in Canada when they get here. So it's been a fascinating social phenomenon, but it's happened organically rather than by intelligent design.
Interestingly, do they tend to get stereotyped into certain industries? Like when I think of Filipino immigrants, I think of the care sector, for example, in Canada. Is that right?
So look, it's obvious that happens, but it happens not because of stereotyping across by painting an entire group of people with the same brush. There's active recruitment efforts by players in the healthcare sector to recruit Filipino healthcare workers who are trained in most instances at a very high level, who have demonstrated the capacity to adjust to life in Canada, who now benefit from community supports of other people who come from their country, their culture, that make it easier for them to integrate when they're here. Certainly, we see different countries that are providing workers disproportionately in the tech sector. It's an interesting thing when you come to realize the productive capacity of the origin country of newcomers to Canada tend to be in certain industries that those countries have a history of training people to perform well in. And the Canadian players in the Canadian economy, including the care sector, have responded through targeted recruitment efforts, which I think explains in large part why you see some uniformity compared to the Canadian population in terms of the professional engagement of people who come here from another country. You tend to see those stereotypes, to use your phraseology, dissipate significantly in the second generation. Okay. When the kids of newcomers arrive here, they tend to find themselves in roughly the same professions that Canadian multi-generation Canadian kids would find themselves in.
Right. Do you think in the current context that immigration from China in large numbers represents any national security risk to Canada?
So this is so important, David. Every single person who comes to Canada is subjected to a rigorous security screening process. And it is so important not to conflate concerns around foreign interference with the Chinese Communist Party with Chinese Canadians, with people who want to come here who may not be supportive and in some instances might actually be persecuted by different governments around the world. I think it's important that we don't necessarily equate a person's nationality or ethnicity with the actions of a government that might be very challenging. So I trust the process that we have in place. It's as rigorous a security screening process as exists for any country in the world. And I think Canadians remain very supportive of high immigration ambition, in part because they know there's such integrity to the process, including security screening. So I'm not concerned that our immigration policy is going to exacerbate any concerns we may have on Canada's engagement with the state in China, because the people who come here cannot simply be painted the same way that the state they come from may be painted with.
So, like the fabled hammer hunting for a nail, the federal government is determined to fix something that isn't broken: Canada's rail cargo system. In the recent budget, Ottawa signaled it intends to resurrect a failed policy called extended interswitching. Effectively, it would force railways to pass off cargo to each other back and forth from origin to destination. This is being presented as a fix for our supply chains and increased resiliency. It's neither, and it is worse. Think of it this way. Say the government were to tell the airlines that from now on, instead of flying directly between two cities, passengers could force one airline to deliver them to a competitor and then switch back again at another airport somewhere en route, at the airline's expense. Contemplate what that would do to the air travel system. It's no different for rail. Imposing such a policy on Canada's railways would actually clog our supply chains. It would slow down cargo and discourage investment. I mean, what company in its right mind would spend money to grow knowing it will be forced to deliver business to a competitor? To be clear, this policy will cause Canadians to pay more for virtually everything that moves by rail. And you know, everything does move by rail at some point. Anyway, for heaven's sake, market forces are performing well, especially compared to overseas supply chains. Our sponsor, CN, set multiple records this past fall and winter for moving grain out of Western Canada. Competition between railways is intense, and rail cargo rates in Canada are among the lowest in the world. Why the government is keen to impose extended interswitching is baffling. Canadians are already struggling with inflation. Do we want even higher prices and longer back orders in stores? There was a time, some of us will remember, when CN was a crown corporation and the government ran the railroad. Every year it lost money and had to be propped up by taxpayers. That has not been the case for years. Government should govern, let modern railroaders do what they do best: move cargo safely and smoothly and efficiently. So in 2015, all the MPs from Atlantic Canada were Liberals, and all the premiers were Liberals. And I knew all the premiers, and I remember talking to them after the 2015 election and saying, this is a perfect constellation to bring real change to Atlantic Canada. What do you need? What do you want? What's your big ask in this unique circumstance? And they all said immigration. They all said we need more people. We need more immigration. And they have pursued that, and they have accomplished that. There are more immigrants going to Atlantic Canada now than there were 10 years ago. Am I right about that?
Yeah, and in fact, between 2006 and 2021 is the last sort of comparator that I saw. We've now tripled our share of the national pie when it comes to newcomers. And don't forget that the pie is now twice the size what it was in 2014. So we have never seen an influx of people like this. I described the social phenomenon earlier in our conversation about so many people moving away from Atlantic Canada in order to seek economic opportunity. The biggest challenges I've got as a local representative now are whether we can build houses quickly enough to accommodate all the people who want to come to our community, rather than witnessing schools close or health services be diminished because so many people were leaving. And I don't raise that out of an attempt to scare people. That's something that was happening in 2015 in my community. We lost a school, and the mental health unit at our largest regional hospital shut down because people left. We've got, for the first time in my life, more young people moving into rural Nova Scotia than are leaving. It's extraordinary to watch, because when newcomers arrive, the other thing we're witnessing is a lot of people my age are moving back home with their kids. We live in more vibrant and dynamic communities than existed 10 years ago. And when I go to the farmers market in New Glasgow, I can taste food from every corner of the world. I can hear music from places that were unfamiliar to me 10 years ago. And I see people who live and work in my community who come from wildly different life experiences. And it makes it a cooler place for me to raise my family in. And what we're seeing is a snowball effect where Atlantic Canada is now presenting itself as an incredible place to live. And the two fastest growing cities in Canada last year were Moncton and Halifax. If you had told me that was going to happen in 2015, I would have laughed you out of the room. And now it's this incredible rejuvenation of communities, big and small. And it's been one of the most incredible transformations that I've had the privilege of watching. And it makes me feel like getting involved in politics and leaving a job that I really did enjoy what was the right thing to do.
Yeah, having been to Moncton, I find that very hard to believe. But in any event,
I'll bite my tongue.
That was a very positive speech. But as a social scientist, I'm interested in this. At the risk of getting into trouble, Atlantic Canada is the whitest, least diverse part of Canada, at least before this most recent wave of immigration. Now, a lot of people, apparently from India, China, the Philippines, are coming into Atlantic Canada. How is that social experiment going?
It's been one of the most beautiful things that I could imagine. We get a reputation for being really friendly on the East Coast, and we are. And one of the things that I've come to understand is I agree that we are one of the most friendly communities that I could ever imagine coming from, but I don't know that we've always been as welcoming to people as we would like to think that we have been. We literally call people come from a ways, even though they may have been there for 3 generations. If you couldn't point to what your 4-time great-grandfather did in the community where you still live, it's almost like you didn't count as being from the province of Nova Scotia. That's changed, and it's been a really
and the Newfies are worse.
Yeah, yeah, and now we say come from away when we want it. But realistically, the thing that I've noticed is people have come to understand the benefits of immigration through their experience of meeting newcomers. When I think about a wave of Filipino healthcare workers that may have arrived in my community in Pictou County, the experience for people at home is that their parent who needs to live in a long-term care facility is now going to receive that care in the same community that their grandkids live in, and they get to have a relationship with their parents as they age, when previously they may have had to go to Halifax. The best example I can think of is the story of Peace by Chocolate, which I'm sure you're familiar with, David. Yes. Tara Kadad, for those who might be unfamiliar with the story, it's a family who made chocolate in Damascus and lost the factory during the war. And they came and started very small with the help of the community, making chocolate in Antigonish, and just a minute from the hospital where I was born. And Tarek will tell you that one of the first conversations he had, despite a lot of support from the community, came from a guy who said, "I'm sorry what happened to you, but why do you have to come here and ruin my shot at finding a job in my community?" That was the first guy that Tarek hired to work on the shop floor of his factory that now has dozens of employees in rural Nova Scotia at the chocolate factory that wasn't there 10 years ago. The experience of my neighbors with newcomers is that they're putting their kids to work and they're taking care of their parents. It's pretty hard to argue that immigration has negative connotation when you're personally experiencing the social and economic benefits in your own family and in your own community, as I would argue the vast majority of people who live in Atlantic Canada now are experiencing firsthand.
You know, it's another thing it's one thing to welcome people in for the function that they provide. It's another thing to truly welcome them in. I come from a small village in Saskatchewan called Prelate. It was entirely white German Catholic, but there was a Chinese family that ran the cafe. That was a lonely thing to do. Everybody liked having the cafe in town, but those people were lonely.
Yeah, there's no question, and I can't put myself in the shoes of someone who's had such a different lived experience to be the first. There are a lot of people who've come to our communities that didn't have that support network. And look, you go across the small towns I grew up in, sure, you can find a family from this country or that country who's making a go of it in Canada, running a business, filling a key gap in the economy, or maybe came for humanitarian reasons. But what you're seeing now is with the existence of a diaspora community, you're actually starting to see a lot of people find the support from people who've been through what they've been through and are helping them integrate more successfully into the broader community. And when you see that first wave of newcomers arrive, yeah, I agree with you. That's a challenging thing that makes it really hard for people to integrate. But when you see the second wave come, it tends to go a little bit more smoothly, both for the people who arrive and for the people who are providing settlement services to help them navigate the community. When we first started welcoming Syrian families to my part of Nova Scotia, we didn't have any experience in dealing with people who've been through what they've been through, and there was not a large Syrian community on the ground. There might have been a professor at St. FX University who spoke their language or maybe shared their religion, but now we actually see that there is a mosque in my community where there has not been before. There is language training in Arabic that's made available to people who are trying to learn English. We now see the similar thing playing out with people who speak Ukrainian that are welcoming newcomers. You're seeing this snowball effect that is a very powerful thing that's making it easier both for the newcomer, but the communities who welcome them are getting better at it. And that serves our interest in the long run when we can demonstrate that we're not just going to find a home for you. We're going to get your kids enrolled in skating lessons. We're going to teach you how to ride the bus, and we're going to set you up with a bank account so you can actually have a paycheck that gets deposited somewhere. These are the kinds of things you learn through practice. And when you have larger numbers of people coming, like everything else, you get better at it with time. And our community's reaping the benefits now.
Quebec doesn't want as many immigrants as you want them to have. How are you going to handle that?
I'll take issue with one part of your statement. I've not set a target for the number of people Quebec should take. We have an agreement with them for a number of years that allows them to choose the folks that they're going to bring. They've got, and just for the sake of explaining where,
but they only want 50,000 people. Legault says he wants 50,000, right? And you're letting in. Yeah. You want to let in 500,000 to the country.
Correct.
So they want 10% of that, but their share of the population is supposed to be 23, 24.
Yeah, that's right. One of the things that I think is really important for people to understand is that maintaining broad-based social support for big immigration numbers demands that we allow communities to see a future for themselves in a much larger Canada. There are some honestly held concerns, not just in Quebec, but with Francophone communities outside of Quebec as well, about whether they can maintain not their ability to speak French personally, but to live their own life in French and receive services in French, that they have sincerely held concerns over. I've made it a huge priority to boost not just the number of Francophone newcomers, but the proportion of Francophone newcomers outside of Quebec where we have jurisdiction, to demonstrate to communities that, in fact, if we target the people who are going to provide services, your community will be able to flourish. My own view is that there's some real similarities with the narrative we see from Quebec and Francophone communities outside of Quebec to rural communities right across Canada. There was a lot of fear that, hey, if everybody comes in, they're just going to go to the big cities. It's going to create opportunities and my kids are going to keep moving away. What we've seen is when we've actually embraced it and tried to encourage people to move to small communities, are results like the ones we're experiencing at home for me that I've described, where it actually allows you to hang on to something that probably was going to disappear if it was left to its own devices. So Quebec will make its decision about how many newcomers it's going to accept, and will respect their jurisdiction on the issue. But my view remains that larger immigration numbers is a good thing for communities in every province. But we'll work with communities and with provinces to do it in a way that they can manage and allows them to see a future for themselves in their vision for within the context of the higher number. And I'm not worried about finding.
But their political clout. I mean, I'm in politics. I think about politics. So one of the things I think about is surely it's going to become an issue if the next time we do boundaries, people say, well, Quebec's share of the House of Commons has fallen to X percentage from Y percentage.
Look, certainly. And one of the things that people have to realize is when they make decisions about their role within the Federation, those decisions have consequences. But I'm less concerned about the makeup of the House of Commons than I am with the well-being of communities. If I'm thinking about communities in Quebec or Francophone communities outside of Quebec, the preoccupation that people communicate to me is, can my child go to a daycare where the staff are going to allow them to speak French? Am I going to be able to go shopping in the language of my choice? Can I receive medical services in the language of my choice? I think we need to do a better job of communicating that immigration is actually a tool to help solve that problem, rather than a source of consternation for people who hold that anxiety. That's where I think we'll be able to overcome this challenge, which frankly exists in small towns and rural communities in every part of Canada. But you have to realize that the world's changing, whether you embrace higher immigration levels or not. The option we saw back home for me was to have small communities die or to embrace immigration as a growth strategy. I hope that communities across the country in every province are asking themselves those tough questions as well.
Well, Herle Burlyites, this confession may surprise you coming from a professional pollster, but I hated math in school. It's not that I wasn't good at it. In fact, I had a natural aptitude for numbers. It's just that math didn't interest me. Could never see why I'd need it. Well, now I do. Because finding a solution to climate change is, at its core, a math problem. Look at it this way. We need to get our carbon dioxide emissions down as close to zero as possible, fast, while subtracting carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. That's the net zero equation, and it's a tough one. In fact, the math gets even harder when we consider how we're going to power all those electric cars we'll be driving and all the clean electricity we'll need to make things like green steel. Ontario's electricity system operator says we'll have to generate at least double our current electricity capacity if we hope to reach net zero. Think of it. That means massive amounts of new, clean electricity, from more wind and solar to hydrogen power and energy storage. The system operator also predicts we'll need more than double the amount of nuclear power as we're currently producing. Canadian-made CANDU nuclear reactors are an energy source that safely produce no greenhouse gases. And right now, those CANDU nuclear plants are already producing more than half of Ontario's electricity, all of it clean and dependable. Doubling that capacity is going to take a lot of planning. Our sponsors at the Nuclear Innovation Institute know you can't just flip a switch to meet that demand. Big energy projects require environmental assessments and a host of other studies to make sure they're done right. That takes time. We need to start that planning now, and nearly 60% of Canadians agree. My polling shows that Canadians across the country support governments doing the environmental groundwork now, so we have the option to add more nuclear power later. Getting ready now is an approach that makes sense, and Canadians are sensible. Because at the end of the day, getting to net zero is a math problem, and nuclear power is part of the answer. Just do the math. Okay, Minister, this takes me to a sort of a fundamental question. Is Canada a thing that exists and has core values and beliefs that define it and distinctive characteristics, and you're welcome to come here and be part of this thing, but you can't change it? Or is Canada a living, evolving tree, as they say in the law, that changes with the composition of the country as it moves on?
Look, I'll give you a classic politician answer. It can be both. I think there are certain core values that we hold, and we don't just hold them. We bake them into the foundational legal documents that underpin Canada as an entity, our Constitution, the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. But those values and our interpretation of the laws that embody those values, they do shift over time. I grew up in a small community. I went to a Catholic church and read scripture on Sundays for years. And you can imagine.
I sang in the choir, if you could believe that.
Look, maybe we can get together and go over some of our hymns. They even let me ring the bell once in a while.
I never knew when. Anyway, but
yeah. But the reality is that if you try to dig in and say the version of what we have today has to be the version of what we have forever, you're kidding yourself. There's all kinds of people who yearn back for some nostalgic vision of Canada that in fact never existed. I always get a kick out of it when people talk about the glory days in North America of the post-war boom in the 50s and 60s. I don't hear that from the Black community. I don't hear that from Indigenous Canadians. I don't hear it from the LGBTQ2 plus community. There's a vision of Canada that may have existed before that treated people who look like you and me really well. But now that we've opened our eyes to the fact, as a white guy who grew up in a white neighborhood, I wouldn't feel very good if our laws didn't protect my neighbors who came from different backgrounds about the country that we've built. So the values that we accept, certainly we want to get people behind the idea that equality is something that we pursue. Defense of the rights of the marginalized is something we insist upon. But the reality is, as you live in an increasingly globalized world, the embrace of people from different parts of the world who have different experiences, who have different knowledge bases, who have different ideas, is going to strengthen our public discourse. It's not going to erode what Canada is. It's going to allow Canada to become a more powerful player on the world scene for the next generation, which is, I think, is something that we should embrace warmly rather than be frightened by.
Yeah, Ken Dryden says to me, things aren't as good as they used to be, and they never were.
It's good. Ken Dryden came to my community during his leadership campaign, and I've been playing the bagpipes for like 30 years. And I was asked to play the pipes for Ken's walk-up into the Plymouth Community Centre. And I learned how to play the Hockey Night in Canada theme song on the bagpipes for the event. And I've never met somebody who's been less impressed than Ken was that I had done that for him. And I don't even think he noticed, to be honest. And I came home feeling totally dejected as like somebody who I thought was this great star in politics and hockey. And I'd spent like 2 months teaching myself how to play it and didn't even get a clap or anything.
Yeah, no, he didn't like being associated with hockey much back then. He was in politics. But,
That's right.
Now that I know you play the bagpipes, I want to see you recreate the scene from So I Married an Axe Murderer. And I want you to play Do You Think I'm Sexy until you collapse from exhaustion. It's a great Mike Myers film. I can tell you're not familiar with it. So I Married an Axe Murderer.
Yeah,
you're a bagpiper. You got to see it.
It's a great film. Yeah. It's a terrific film. Mike Myers.
So, since one of the aspects of the policy and of the new targets that has become controversial is the intersection between immigration and housing, because housing is so topical right now and the cost of housing. I had the head of the Daily Bread Food Bank on this show last week, and he told me that there are hundreds of thousands of people in Toronto who work full-time hours who are coming to the food bank for money. Mm-hmm. Coming to the food bank to get food because they can't feed themselves. And part of that is the cost of rent, and part of that is the cost of housing. So housing is a huge issue. It does seem likely that 500,000 people a year is going to exacerbate the cost of housing, is it not?
So there's a real connection between immigration and housing needs, but let's be clear about what the problem is and what the problem is not. So the 500,000 new permanent residents that come into Canada each year is not 500,000 new people who need homes. It's common for almost half of the people who are coming in to actually already be here with a temporary status, whether they started as a student, they came in as a temporary foreign worker, and they transitioned to permanent residency. So the actual number of new permanent residents is much that require housing is much smaller than the overall number of new permanent residents who come in. One of the things that I'm very concerned about is the explosion in interest for some of our temporary programs. The International Student Program, for example, does not have a cap on it for Canada. It's driven by demand. Similar with people who come in on a work permit to fill a gap in the economy.
This is how all of our universities are funding themselves, isn't it? They're all paying for they're all dealing with reduced transfers from government by taking as many foreign students who they charge really high tuitions for. Too, right?
It's institution to institution. It can vary. Some have not fully embraced this in their financial model. Others have come to rely upon it exclusively. And what makes matters worse is that there are some institutions out there amongst the private career colleges, and I just to be very careful, there are some very good private career colleges in Canada who I don't want to apply this critique to. There are others that I am convinced have come to exist just to profit off the backs of vulnerable international students. It's not right, and it's difficult for me with the policy levers I have to simply solve the challenge because there's mixed federal provincial jurisdiction, but this is something we need to address. And when we see I think it's 84 designated learning institutions just in the Peel region. You're kidding yourself. That wasn't a joke. But what you see is an explosion of people who come in through an uncapped program who don't just come in large numbers, but they come into certain highly populated pockets of the country that are already struggling with housing needs. So yes, we need to turn our minds to this. We've been thinking about it for a number of months, of course. But before I say, we have to limit our immigration ambition, you got to think about the counterfactual, because for the reasons I articulated earlier, welcoming fewer newcomers will have disastrous economic and social consequences over the next generation, and we cannot afford those consequences. So the answer to our housing challenges is not to severely limit the number of newcomers coming to Canada. It's to address the housing challenges by building more housing, by making sure that we actually are welcoming newcomers who have the skills to build houses. When I talk to developers right now, the number one challenge most of them are having, assuming it's not municipal zoning, is that even when they have approvals to go ahead with a project, they don't have access to the builders that are going to be able to allow them to complete the projects they want to build. The other piece that we need to do is continue to regionalize our immigration programs. We've seen tremendous success with the Atlantic Immigration Program. We've seen the early signs of success, though it's in the pilot phase, with the Rural and Northern Immigration Program. We're working now on a category-based selection model immigration, which could be a game changer, which will allow me and my successors to actually select newcomers, not just based on their overall score through the permanent residency process, but by the sector that they work in and the part of the country that they're going to. If we're able to increase the number of people who are going to work in healthcare in Nova Scotia and home building in Toronto, this is going to dramatically improve access to public services and housing. At the same time, we can continue to bring in those newcomers for economic and demographic reasons. So it's details and policy design really matter. As nice as it is to slap something on a bumper sticker, the answer to our housing challenges is not to close the door to newcomers. It's to build more houses and to make it more affordable for people to enter the market and to take care of people who can't afford market housing. Hard to put that on the back of your bumper, but the reality is sometimes we need to speak in full sentences if we want to identify solutions to great social problems our country's facing.
It doesn't feel to me, Minister, though, like we do this as a country in a very smart way. And feel free to correct me if I'm wrong, but I've been really shocked as I've been reading about this to learn how little coordination there is between the three levels of government on this important topic. And it feels to me like it must be the case that not just in housing, but in almost all of the infrastructure stock in communities must be falling behind these immigration rates, whether it's houses or transit and roads or schools or whatever. Like some people decide who gets in and other people have to deal with who gets in. And there doesn't seem to be much talking between those or collaboration between those groups. Am I wrong?
No, you're not wrong. And one of the things that I find fascinating is there's a tendency for people who get into politics to, when you're on the governing side of the house, to pretend that social problems don't exist. And the reality is we can recognize that these challenges exist and then start working to solve them. But I think for generations, Canada has not done a good job of connecting the three levels of government to justify population growth. Let's park immigration for the moment because our communities, different communities across Canada have been struggling with population growth. Much of it has been driven by internal migration to larger urban centers over the last generation. The current generation and the next one, we're going to continue to see population growth driven by immigration, including interprovincial migration. One of the things that I'm have started to do some preliminary work and thinking on now, and we're in the middle of a strategic review of Canada's immigration policy that I hope to draw more feedback from not the people who administer the system, but who use the system on, is the concept of long-term population planning. The reality is, and I've had these conversations with Minister LeBlanc, Infrastructure, Minister Freeland of Finance. Canada's population at some point in time will be twice what it is now. Whether that's 40 years or 80 years from now will depend on decisions that future policymakers take. But at some point in time, our country will continue to get larger. We have to make a decision now to start planning for that growth. Where I think we're missing as a society, a big part of the analysis is how can we prepare communities for what they're going to look like at twice their size. I live in a Pictou County. There's about 5 towns, roughly 25,000 people between the 5 towns that are connected. We should be asking ourselves now, if we're going to get to 50,000, where do the water pipes go? Where's the next ball field going to be?
Exactly.
Do we need another school? What hospital services do we need to expand upon? This is the next frontier, not on immigration policy planning, but on our population strategy that should mirror our industrial strategy, which should mirror our community development strategy. I hope before I cease my time in this position to start that, put that conversation into motion through actual tools that will allow communities to deal with their long-term policy development over a 30, 40-year time horizon. If I can achieve that, I will be very happy when I am long retired from politics, watching things play out in my community and others, seeing that we've actually brought that thoughtfulness and realizing that it's not good enough just to get people here, but we need to set them and their communities up for success. So we're starting these conversations now, but in the meantime, putting the brakes on population growth and immigration would be an enormous mistake. So we need to manage it during the intervening period with investments in infrastructure, investments in healthcare, investments in housing, but put in place the tools that allow communities to plan for significant growth over the next few generations.
Oh, all right. You know, Minister, sometimes I have thoughts in my head that make me think I'm becoming a socialist. But let me put this question to you this way. Do we really have a shortage of workers in Canada? Or do we have a shortage of workers who are prepared to work for what business wants to pay for labor?
Look, I think both are true, but it's fascinating. We're living in a very unique time when it comes to the balance between workers and businesses. And I think the policies we adopt now might be very appropriate for the current context, but might need to be adjusted should the context change going forward. Right now, we have a shortage of workers in Canada, and there's no question in my mind about that. It's not actually as bad as it was last summer, when we had nearly 1 million jobs open in the Canadian economy that could not be filled. Certainly, some of those jobs were lower wage positions that were very difficult to find Canadians to fill. But some of those jobs were also for software engineers or for medical specialists. The reality is we have had a labor shortage over the course across sectors at every skill level. When I look at what...
How do you define what a shortage is, Minister? If I could just stop you. Is a shortage when it becomes too expensive for business to pay people, or is a shortage when there's literally nobody to do the job? Like, I'm really trying to find out whether we are bidding down the price of labor by the people we bring in from outside.
So if you're in an ordinary economic context and you have an uncapped temporary worker program and you significantly increase your immigration ambition, it's possible that you could put a downward pressure on wages depending on who you target to bring in. One of the things that we need to be asking ourselves, though, is how do we bridge players in the economy through what is still a very uncertain and difficult time following the pandemic? And how do we bring in the skilled workforce that's going to maximize the strategic opportunity in key sectors that will be big for the next 30, 40 years? So we need to be starting to think about who do we need to be bringing in that will grow access to the critical minerals we need to become a green energy battery powerhouse? Who do we need to be bringing in that's going to allow us to maximize the opportunity in cybersecurity and artificial intelligence? And that's one part of the equation where we literally don't have the workers today with the skills necessary to fill those gaps. On the other side of the analysis, when we're looking at the short term, keep in mind what we have just been through and what the Canadian business community has just been through. Over the last couple of years, businesses have been kept afloat because we wanted to prevent economic scarring by supporting them and ensuring that they were still here to contribute to the economic recovery. And thank God for communities who rallied behind small businesses. Thank God for the hard work of business owners in our communities. The strategy worked in large part, much better than it did in almost every other economy in the world. The challenge that a lot of these businesses are having now is that they can't function even though their customers have returned because they don't have access to the labor that they need or the talent that they need to succeed. If we're going to let a business whose bones are strong and fundamental economic case still makes sense, if we're going to let them fail because they don't have access to workers today, it would have been a better strategy to let them fail 3 years ago or at the beginning of the pandemic. Yeah, 3 years ago. So when I look at the policies that we needed to address when we had an extraordinary labor shortage where most people who wanted to work were working at the lowest level of unemployment in the history of Canada just over the last couple of months. We needed to inject more labor into the economy to allow those businesses to hang on so we don't, at the end of many billions of dollars being invested to keep businesses afloat, have them close in any event. As we go forward, we're going to need to shift our policies between getting people in here to help businesses stay afloat to bring people in that are going to mirror the industrial opportunities that are going to sustain Canada's economy over the next number of decades.
Okay, so now tell me about this temporary foreign workers program. Because what I know about this thing, I don't like at all. Because I hear basically two things about it. One of which is I think it is bidding down the price of labor for Canadians. And the second thing is it sounds like these people themselves are exploited. So there's no winners other than the businesses that profit off of this low-wage labor that we bring in. Why do we do that?
So a couple of points. The temporary foreign workers program, people who come in here temporarily to fill a gap in the labor force, Canadians have an image that all of them are working in low-wage jobs that locals wouldn't take, typically in primary industry. The typical example is in the agricultural sector. There are some cases where there are low-wage workers coming in and are being exploited, and we, along with provincial governments, because both governments have a hand in this, need to crack down on bad actors. Absolutely. But let me tell you about the experience in a lot of rural Canada, where they don't have people who still live in the community who can work in those jobs, often because so many of the young people have moved away. If it weren't for the temporary foreign worker program, there would not be a lobster fishery in the community where I grew up. This is the most important economic driver for my part of Nova Scotia. If they didn't, the guys who rely on temporary foreign worker programs in either their processing facilities or in the transportation sector to get their product to market, if they lost access to the truck drivers who have come in through the temporary foreign worker program or to the people who work in their plants where they process food, the fishermen who are fish and lobster for 5-6 generations would not have anybody to make the product that is actually saleable. The challenge that you've got to understand that a lot of Canada is living with is that the temporary foreign worker who comes in isn't just enriching the person who might own the farm. They're protecting the jobs of all of the people who work in the agricultural sector that depend on key points in the supply chain, in addition to supporting the business that they work for directly. There's no simple answer to this. I think you have to be careful when the economy is in greater need of labor, you can reduce some of the administrative requirements. When the labor market tightens up, that's why we have the LMIA process to make sure that businesses prove they can't find workers locally. that will allow them to fill the gaps in their business before they have access to the program. And every business that has access to those lower wage positions for temporary foreign workers needs to demonstrate that they have tried and were not able to find local workers. In one case, there's a fish processor in my community who actually bought a bus and offered jobs to everyone in the community who was on social assistance. They found 9 people they brought to work. One of them lasted more than one day in the job. If they didn't have access to the program, there'd be nobody in that part of the community I represent that could sell lobster products that would get to market. And you want to see a negative impact on a province's economy, pull the lobster fishery out of Nova Scotia and see what happens.
Right. Okay. Cool. I got one last question about immigration for you, and I was thinking about it as I watched the Roxham Road thing go down, and that's been settled. I gather you got to deal with the Americans, it was a disturbingly large number of people for people in that region of Quebec to deal with, but it's a small number of people in the grand scheme of things, and it made me wonder whether your people have modeling about what Canada can expect in terms of people trying to get here as climate change makes parts of the world unlivable. Are you trying to get a glimpse into a crystal ball and say, what is going to be coming to our shores trying to get into this country 20 years from now?
So look, not an explicit model that spits out a number of people at the end of the day, but we're foolish not to be thinking about this now. One of the things that is more front of mind for me is how Canada can play a role in helping solve the global challenges with irregular migration, motivated not just by climate change, but also by climate change, because Canada is blessed by geography when it comes to people seeking to get here through irregular ways. Look, not to be too simplistic about it, but we're surrounded by 3 oceans, and the United States, which has historically been the top destination for people around the world to move to, we actually surpassed them, by the way, because Canada's awesome and people want to come here during the pandemic. But one of the reasons we see relatively fewer numbers is it's hard to get here if you're not somebody who can afford to come here, and a lot of the people who can afford to come here can often qualify for regular immigration programs. So where my mind is going is to say, what role should Canada play to help solve the global challenge of irregular migration? Certainly, resettlement has got to be a part of it. And Canada, through the pandemic, resettled more refugees than any other country in the world. About 1/3 of the global total in both 2020 and 2021 came to Canada. But that's people who come through official refugee resettlement programs, not people who just show up. We've got countries that are hosting millions of people who've walked across.
Well, Germany had 1 million Syrians show up, didn't they?
Bingo. Absolutely, they did. And look at some of the countries like Turkey or Jordan, who just dwarf the numbers that show up in many other countries in the world. We just actually introduced a new program that I hope catches on like wildfire. It's an economic migration program for people who happen to be displaced. There's 100 million displaced people in the world, David, and they have skills. The province of Nova Scotia had a trip to Kenya recently and made 65 job offers through this program to nurses who are going to be coming to our community. Back to my that early lesson I had with a partner at the firm I started with. If we can convince people to embrace resettlement, not out of their sense of altruism, but their self-interest, we're going to be able to solve one of the world's great problems for the next generation. When refugees come to our country, they come with a heck of a lot more than what they're packing in their bags. And if we can work with groups that can identify the skills and talents they have to contribute, we're going to demonstrate to those countries who've been reticent to accept newcomers that this is going to help you solve social problems in your own country. I think we can actually envision a world where we don't deny the basic economic, civil, and political rights to people who grow up in a refugee camp. The idea that refugee camps are something that we just accept as normal it's an enormous failure of humanity. And if Canada can play a role, not just in resettling the whole world, but developing the programs that will increase the absorptive capacity of countries all over the world, we will be able to have a much bigger impact on the global challenge of irregular migration driven by climate, war, oppression, persecution, whatever, than we could ever have if we go it alone and focus on how many people are going to come to our shores.
Yeah. I just assume at some point the world's not going to let us keep all this land and water for 50 million people.
Well, I expect that someday we will be servicing a lot more than 50 million people.
Yeah, I think that's right. All right, let's talk some politics before we quickly wrap up. You come from a part of the country that has been pretty resistant to whatever the post-PC Conservative Party has been selling since 2000. Do you see that changing? Or is Atlantic Canada a Liberal stronghold?
Look, coming from the seat that I come from, where 3 of the 4 previous MPs were Peter MacKay, Elmer MacKay, and Brian Mulrooney, I don't believe in strongholds. And as an incumbent, if you start to believe that, you'll quickly become a retired politician. Right. That said, I do think there is an enormous divide between where Conservatives locally are at and where the federal Conservatives are. That doesn't mean that there's not risk. That doesn't mean that we can rest on our laurels and assume that we're going to sweep the Atlantic region again. We need to work for it. And we need to inspire in people the possibility that things will continue to get better for them and their families. But when I see... there's 2 kinds of things that I think turn people off, and you'll be surprised at what I think is the more powerful one because it gets a lot less attention. The Conservative Party's sort of further right wing that has seemingly subsumed the main narrative is being driven by attaching themselves to the Freedom Convoy, their protest against vaccine policies. This latest spat with the CBC that Poilievre is on about, the embrace of Jordan Peterson and cryptocurrency. It all rubs people as being a little bit off and not really for me. But the things when you actually dig in that give people more consternation, when you talk to them on the doorsteps, people don't walk through their days thinking about Pierre Poilievre's affiliation with Jordan Peterson. They think about whether he's going to erode the Canada Pension Plan or EI, programs that they have paid into and supported their entire careers. And these are not falsely held beliefs. There are opposition motions from a few months ago where the federal Conservatives are saying we got to do away with these payroll taxes that finance EI and CPP. If people come to honestly believe, as they have experienced during the late years of the Harper government, that there's going to be a tax on EI in Atlantic Canada, that they're going to be described as a culture of defeat, that they're not going to have access to old age security at 65, they get their backs up. By the way, we really care about the environment on the East Coast, and you start to see a divide between the provincial PCs in Atlantic Canada, who have been very successful and currently hold New Brunswick, PEI, and Nova Scotia, where you actually have some of the now premiers, then party leaders during the campaign saying that we're a different party with different values, and I don't want to be attached to that beast. And I think that there's a lot of people who are more naturally progressive conservative, and despite what challenges they may have with me as their MP, with us as a party, my sense is when they look at the alternative and they view that the supports they've paid into are going to be eroded, and there's a bit of that right-wing American-style politics creeping in, they say, no thanks, that's not what I'm about.
What do you think about Poilievre? Is he effective? Does he worry you?
Look, the things I worry about are the health of my family and the well-being of my community. I have fun with Poilievre's approach to politics. We need to take seriously the fact that he's a talented communicator. I probably know him better than most people in politics on our side of the house as well. When I was the PS on environment, every day in question period, when he had something about our price on pollution, or his carbon tax, as he calls it, I was the main guy to take questions from him. During the entire pandemic, I was the PS on finance, and I sat on finance committee with him and spent 8 hours a day with him several days a week. And I also was taking all the questions in question period when the minister wasn't there. on our pandemic response. He's effective if you want to have somebody who gets a punch in on the government and a lot of Facebook views. But I'll tell you, I don't think he responds well on his back foot. And when we punch back and land punches, and nobody pays attention to what I was saying as a parliamentary secretary in the House of Commons, but there's some bizarre responses I've seen after we absolutely hammered it on something that he didn't know how to respond to. Left to his own devices, he can certainly put together a pithy 90-second Facebook video with the best of them. And we need to be live to the fact that he's speaking to people's anxieties. But my experience has been that when you have someone who's trying to prey on people's fears and anxieties that are very real, if you can offer a vision for Canada that inspires in them a sense that life will be better for their kids than it has been for them, that if you want to work, there will be a job that will allow you to put food on the table and keep a roof over your head. If you can inspire people that politics is a pathway to a better future for their community and their country, I take the inspiring side of that political argument over the predation on fears every day of the week. And I'll tell you, you can inspire a lot of people to vote based on what fears they may have. You can inspire a lot of people to come and volunteer for a campaign if they actually believe in what you're pitching rather than are just mad at the other guy. There's going to be a few hundred local campaigns that play out during the next election. And if we can attract good candidates and have an inspiring national message on the good that government can do for communities, I like our chances.
Okay, put a little bit more life in that, because I'm going to challenge you and I'm going to say to you that people are sick of you people. And they want to defeat you. In all things being equal, they'd rather have a new government after the next election. And the reason I know that is because history. So you're trying to do something that hasn't been done in more than 100 years, which is same government led by the same person, seeks election after 10 years in office and wins re-election. And the reason it isn't done is because after 10 years, people get sick of you. It's not unique to you. How do you combat that? How do you give people the sense that a 10-year-old government deserves a new mandate?
I'll tell you, it's not easy. And I don't want to pretend that it is for 1 second. The reality is the challenges that we're facing now are unique to what we faced in 2015 and are unique to what we faced during the pandemic. What I see staring me in the face is opportunity for Canada like I could never have envisioned before. When I look at the bones of our economy with significant population growth, with the most educated workforce anywhere globally, with the raw materials that the world is going to be demanding in volumes that they have never been demanded before, I see a really challenging 6-12 month window where people who have had a difficult time during the pandemic and the recovery are really concerned about their well-being and their future. But I think the opportunity that people are going to be seeing on the 2, 3, 10-year time horizon is going to inspire a sharp contrast between the Liberal and Conservative Party in terms of what vision for the future is going to serve their interests. A government that's going to invest to take advantage of these strategic opportunities rather than go back to a history of making cuts to social programs and back to a history of letting the free market economy help the wealthiest members of society, and instead see an opportunity for us to pursue strategic growth and advance supports that help them and their families. I think that we can continue to inspire people that we're the right folks for the job. So it's not easy. We've been at it for 7.5 years now. But when I look at the things that we have been able to do, it gives me faith that we're going to be able to continue to do big things. I'm telling you, David, not to be cheesy about it, but half the kids who lived in poverty in my community don't anymore 7 years ago. We are building affordable housing units for people that don't have enough cash. I ran into somebody in my community a few months back who told me she doesn't bring her kids to the grocery store anymore. And it's heartbreaking to hear why. She's afraid her kid is going to see the cashier tell her she doesn't have enough money to pay for what's in her cart, and she doesn't want to walk them back to the aisle when she puts a box of cereal on the shelf. Tell me that woman has a better future under Pierre Poilievre government, who opposed the Canada Child Benefit, who opposed investments in EI, who opposed continuing to allow people to retire at 65 with old age security. He's not some working class hero. And if people start to understand that they're going to have a better chance at a good paying job with us, that they might have a plant go up in their community, like the Michelin investment in rural Nova Scotia we made recently, that they might actually have an opportunity to retire not just at 65, but with enough cash in their pocket to pay for groceries. That's the kind of thing that people are going to say, you know what, whatever challenges we've had over the past 7.5 years, if this is a stark choice between somebody who's going to help my family and somebody who's just going to rant about the Liberals, I take us 10 times out of 10.
Cool. All right. Apropos of nothing, say something in French to me.
Bon, quand j'ai commencé ma carrière en politique, je ne parle pas un mot en français. Maintenant, j'ai l'habilité pour communiquer comme ça, mais je ne suis pas parfaitement bilingue. C'est essentiel pour moi de continuer d'améliorer la qualité de mon français.
There you have it, Canadian politics. Add a new name to the list. Minister Fraser, thank you so much for spending some time with me. I'm hugely impressed with you. This was a very thoughtful interview, and I really, really appreciated your time. This was sponsored by the TELUS and CN and the Nuclear Innovation Institute. I want to thank everybody who watched or listened, and I particularly want to thank Minister Fraser for his time out of his busy day, and Godspeed to you.
A pleasure as always. Merci beaucoup.
Take care.